Okay, it's just about time to get started this morning. Glad to see everyone here in their orange and getting ready for Welcome Back Cats. This is always a big day, and we sure are glad to have the college students back. I went out to the Cats for Christ building on campus earlier this week, and of course, they were all busy with the students coming by and getting water, and the building looks real nice. So those who have worked on it inside, that God is in control. We don't have to worry about the things that we can't control, but he said in every situation, let your request be known to God. So, in verse 7, the result of that should be then, as we do that, as we go to our Heavenly Father in prayer about situations, and in this context, he's just talking about those difficulties that might arise and how God can help us. He says, the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. And we talked about the peace of God. The peace of God is the exact opposite of the anxiety that he talks about in verse 6 there. So the peace, which would be a contentment, a tranquility, an assurance that God is in control, it's the exact opposite of the fear and the worry that would come on by us not knowing what's going to happen. The peace of God is that calmness, that sense of well-being that will come from God. It's the peace of God. And he goes on and says, it transcends all understanding. Now I want us to spend a little bit of time this morning talking about what that means, that the peace of God transcends understanding. Does this mean that the Christian can't understand when he's experiencing that peace? Okay, somebody says no, and that's exactly right. To experience peace, to experience this kind of peace is to know it. I mean, he's not talking about something mystical that I can't know. He's talking about something that I can experience it, and by that experience, know it. But at the same time, he says it transcends all understanding. So, yeah.
It doesn't really make logical sense that you would be at peace when you still have.
Okay, you're exactly right, Norma. She said it doesn't make logical sense when you're under difficulties, when in a situation where you should normally be fearful and worried, to have this peace doesn't make sense. Who does it not make sense to? That's a big question there. The non-believer, yes. Leanne says the non-believer, and that's what the Apostle Paul is talking about here. He's saying to the Christian, we can rejoice in trials. All through this book, even though the first chapter, he's talking about the hardships that they're facing, the persecutions and the trials that they're facing, but he said even in the midst of those difficulties, you can rejoice, which would again be the exact opposite of what you would think. Go through a hardship and rejoice, have joy? No. But Paul says, you can. That's what the Christian should expect. And here, in a situation which would normally lead to anxiety and fear, he says you can have peace. The Christian has that peace because they depend on God. They take everything to God in prayer and have the faith and the confidence. We talked last week about the faith that it takes to trust God in those situations. But the Christian can have that peace, that sense of calm and well-being, even in the most difficult situation, and the world can't understand that. What does the word transcend mean? Right, to go beyond. And there's also another interesting aspect of that word transcend. If you look at the original language, if we were able to read the original language, it not only means to surpass something or go beyond, like you're saying, but it also means to be of more value, exceptional value. To be exceptionally valued, to surpass in value, to be better. So I believe, too, that not only was Paul saying it goes beyond understanding for the non-Christian, but it is more valuable than understanding. Now, what would that mean if he's saying this peace of God is more valuable than understanding? How would that work? Well, think about it this way. If I'm in a difficult situation, let's just say, for example, as a simple illustration, let's say I fell overboard on a boat and somebody throws me a life jacket. How valuable is that life jacket? It is pretty valuable, all right? So here I am as a Christian, and I am experiencing trouble, I'm experiencing difficulty, I'm experiencing persecution, or for us it could be some other difficulty in life. I'm experiencing that, and I have the opportunity to have peace. Somebody throws me the lifeline. In this context, what's the lifeline? The what? Well, it is the life jacket, but in this example that Paul's giving us, what is the life jacket? It is peace, and how do I receive it? Through prayer. Through prayer. I receive that by trusting in God. All right? I receive that. So here we have a peace that is the exact opposite of the anxiety and the turmoil. I get it through prayer, and that is it's something that the world can't understand, but it's more valuable than the world trying to figure out their situation and do something about it. See, the world has to rely on their own understanding. So they're in a difficulty, what do they have to do? They have to figure out how to get out of it. They have to see if they can do something about it. And Paul's saying, as Christians, there's something more valuable than us trying to use our own minds to figure out something that I have no control over. And he says what that is going to God in prayer and receiving that peace as a result of letting God handle the things that I have no control over. That is something that's more valuable. So it is something that the world can't understand, but it is also something that is more valuable than the world trying to figure things out by themselves. I've often said this, in times of sorrow, when we lose a loved one or someone's sick or something of that nature, if you didn't have God to rely on, to go on, to turn your cares over to Him, how much more difficult would life be? How much more sorrowful would life be? And so the things that come from God, such as this peace, is something that goes way beyond and is more valuable than what the world would be able to figure out. They can't understand that because they don't have God to rely on. All right, any question about that? All right. I think last week I gave you an example of this, but I want to throw it out there again just to make sure, because I think it was pretty much at the end of class, but I want to show you an example of what we're talking about. Look at Daniel, the 3rd chapter, for just a minute. And I know I brought this up, but like I said, it was at the end of class. In Daniel, the 3rd chapter, you have King Nebuchadnezzar setting up a gold image, and he commands all the people. He says, when you hear the sound of all these instruments of music playing, he says, I want you to bow down and worship that image. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had already been, along with Daniel, had already been elevated to the court of the king. So they were officials in the court of King Nebuchadnezzar. And when all of this was happening, it tells us that the people, the other officials, saw these men not doing what King Nebuchadnezzar had commanded. So they went to him and they said, look, Your Majesty, they pay no attention to what you've commanded them. They don't serve your gods or worship your image. And so they told the king about it. And verse 13 of Daniel 3, it says Nebuchadnezzar was furious with rage. He was mad because somebody wasn't obeying him. And so he brought the men in and he asked them about it, and he said, I'm going to give you one more chance. You either bow down to this image when you hear all this music, or I'm going to throw you into the furnace. And he says, what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? So again, here's Nebuchadnezzar, and he's thinking about what he had commanded and them disobeying it, and he knows why they don't want to worship or bow down to this image, because he says, well, if you don't do it this time, I'm going to throw you in the furnace, and what God? So he knows that they worship some other God. But then in verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves. Other translations say, we are not careful or anxious about answering you. And that word anxious would be the equivalent, of course it would be in Hebrew, but it would be the equivalent of what we're talking about over here in Philippians 4 when he says, we're not worried. That's what they're saying. We're not worried about answering you. We're not worried about, there's no need to defend ourselves in this matter, because they went on and said, if we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it. And he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. Now, I want to emphasize this part. He says our God can deliver us, but he goes on, or they go on and say, and he will deliver us from your hand. There's a difference from being delivered from the fire, and there's something else to be delivered from Nebuchadnezzar's hand. Because they went on in verse 18, it says, but even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. They were looking at it as, look, we might even be thrown into the furnace of fire. But by doing that, we're delivered from your hand. God will deliver us. They will be better off, even if they're thrown into the fire and destroyed. They're going to be better off. That's the confidence that we ought to have in God. Not worried. God can deliver us from this trial, okay. But if we aren't delivered, then God will deliver us ultimately in the end. And that's, as Christians, how we have to walk through this world, because God's not going to take us out of every troubling situation, is he? He's not going to, he may choose to, and that was the attitude here. God can take me out of this, or he can help me through it. And we have to remember to trust God. That's what brings us the peace, is trusting God. And that's what they had. They had a peace to be able to stand before him and say, we're not worried. And so that's a great example of what Paul's talking about over in Philippians 4 chapter. Any question about that before we go on? All right. Then understanding that, verse 8, Paul says, finally, brothers and sisters. And when he says finally, he shows us he's moving on and fixing to wrap this letter up to them. He says, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. All right. Obviously, the Apostle Paul is telling them in this to have their mind set on things other than the troubles that they might face. All right? Because it's not as if Paul's just all of a sudden throwing some random think positive in there. What he's saying is, in the face of the troubles that you're going to be facing, set your mind on the things that are good. Now let's look at some of these words that the Apostle Paul was using here. For instance, Paul says, whatsoever is true. What does this mean? What is the word true? How can we, when he's telling us to set our minds on things that are true, what's true?
What God has said.
What God has said, that's one instance of what is true. God defines, truth. Our word is truth. But it's not just the things of God here. What, can there be things that are true outside of that realm? Yeah, because when we think of, when we're thinking about, obviously, the morality of God and so forth, as that is the basis of truth. But he's using that word in a very general, broad sense here. When Paul says true, he's talking about things that are reliable of character. Those things that have integrity. True. Those things that are true. It's not just saying focus your mind on the Word of God. Obviously, we as Christians should do that, but he's saying focus your mind on the things that are reliable and have integrity. All right? So as Christians, we ought to focus our attention on those things that are reliable, that are truth, instead of the trouble and the problems of the world. Let me give you an example of that. I can choose to fill my mind in this world with all kinds of things. But not everything is good for me. I can watch the news and become just as depressed as anybody on earth. Now, some of the things that I see on the news may sound good, but I've got to ask myself, is everything I'm hearing true? And that's what I'm talking about when I say, focus your mind on things that are true. People can be throwing all kinds of information at me, and it doesn't matter from what side it's coming. If you want to talk about politics, man, I can get all kinds of information out there. Question I've got to ask myself, is everything I'm hearing true? Or I might look at the problems that are within, a city or within a neighborhood. You know, my neighborhood where I live has a Facebook page, and a lot of times I just don't even want to mess with it. You know, I could go there to find out information about it, but there's all kinds of other things on there. And the first thing you got to ask yourself is any of this true? The things that are true in this world, whether good or bad, are the things that we need to focus our minds upon. When I say bad, there may be some information out there that says this is bad, and it warns me to stay away from it. And that's how I would use information about something being bad. If I examine it, find out it's true, then I stay away from it. I don't dwell on it, focus on it. The things that are true that are good, I can spend my attention focusing on that. But that's what Paul's saying. In the face of all the trouble and the trials that life presents to us, focus your mind on what is true. And of course, part of that would be the Word of God. Any question or anything to add to that? Yes, Alan? Well, I think that's what we've got to determine. I mean, when you say, is it in and of itself true? If you're talking about God's Word, then in and of itself it is truth. But if I'm talking about information or things out there in the world, a lot of times I have to determine by investigation, is this true? And then make a determination, okay, is this good or bad? Once I've determined, okay, from the information I've gathered, I see it's true. Now I've got to determine, is it good or bad? If it's bad, get rid of it. If it's something that's good, then I can turn my attention toward it. I think that's the way that we should handle information. We live in an information age, and not everything that we are told is truth. But those things that are reliable of character, and that's one of the definitions of this word, is something that we should be focusing our attention upon. All right. The next word that Paul goes in on is noble, that which is noble. What does it mean to be noble? We talk about nobility and things of that nature. What is noble? What is it? Royalty? Well, we often want to think of royalty as being noble. Okay, now I like that definition better. Jason said somebody who is upstanding, somebody who would tell the truth. Honorable, that's right. That is a very good definition of the word noble. Honorable. Worthy of respect. It's the exact opposite of things that are cheap and vulgar. Again, talking about the information age. When you're out there looking at stuff, you can see a lot of cheap and vulgar stuff. That's the stuff you want to get out of your mind. There's also that which is honorable or worthy of respect. And Paul says you focus your mind and attention upon those things. He also says that which is right. Think about that which is right. Well, what's the difference between what's right and what's true and what's noble? What does the word right here mean?
Opposite of wrong.
Okay, Jerry says the opposite of wrong. And I'd agree with that. But there's a sense in which the Apostle Paul is using this word. What? Okay. In a sense, if we understand how this word that's used here is defined, there would be a sense, if you're talking about God's rules, then yes, righteous would be a way to define that. Okay, There are other words in our list that are going to be defined that way. Maggie says moral, decent, but there's other words in this list that are going to be defined that way. What is right? Okay, right is someone who is just or conforms to the rules. That's what this word means, something that is just or conforms to the rules. And so what they're talking about is that, you know, even in society, we can, you know, this is not talking about somebody that's so straight they bend over backwards, but somebody who is lawful, somebody who wants to do what is right, we say. And so they obey the laws of the land, they're a good citizen. You know, I'll give you an example. This may, you know, I hope this doesn't hit anyone here, but the laws of the land. We're to pay taxes. Jesus said, render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God. We're commanded to pay our taxes. And yet, in our society, people think nothing of cheating or bending the rules to get by because they don't like paying taxes, so they justify it and say, oh, but, you know, they're just, the government's just taking what is mine. Well, that's right, but the law says at this particular time that they have the right to tax you this way. And so what is right would be one who conforms to those laws even when we don't like those laws, and not justify it by some way. So it's one who conforms to the rules or does what is right. To think on that which is pure. Now, Maggie, what does pure mean? Okay, there we go. That's right. That which is moral, that which is without moral defect, one who has proper motives. Pure, to be pure in heart, that's one of the things that Jesus spoke about in the Sermon on the Mount, those that are pure of heart. That's somebody that is not hypocritical, somebody who is not, saying one thing, doing another, but has pure motives. Somebody that is moral and trying to do what is decent. So we should think on the things that are pure. He also goes on and says, think on the things that are lovely. What does it mean to think on the things that are lovely? Lovely here is pretty much just how we would define it in our society today. What is something that's lovely to you?
Pleasing to us.
Yeah, something that is pleasing, something that is lovely by its nature, and and if we have the right heart and the right motives, then something that is lovely by its nature is pleasing to us. But that's definitely a way to define this. That which is lovely is something that is pleasing, something that is pleasant. And with the right attitudes, then the right things are lovely to us. And so he's telling us, think on the things that are lovely by their nature. He also goes on and says, think on the things that are admirable. What is something that's admirable? Admirable is deserving of approval. It's kind of like noble. Noble is worthy of praise and respect, honorable. Admirable is just something you've done a good job, something that's worthy of approval. I admire somebody who, gives it their all.
Somebody that's done more than required, maybe.
Okay? Somebody, if in a certain sense, many times if somebody's gone above and beyond, Norma says, then that's something that is admirable. I guess a lot of times it can be defined by where are our standards. You know, how high are my standards? If my standards are not very high and somebody goes beyond it, then that may be admirable to me, but if my standards are higher, it may take more for me to admire them. But what he's saying is, look for areas of approval instead of areas of criticism and condemnation. You know, I can look at you or anybody in here. Let's just take David because he's admirable. I can look at him and I can see lots of good that he does. Or I can look at him and try to find fault and always criticize. And what Paul is trying to tell us is, look for things that you admire instead of the things that you want to condemn and criticize. I can look at anybody almost and find something that I admire in them. I mean, even if you go back to Luke, the Gospel of Luke, Jesus was giving a parable of, we call it sometimes the parable of the unjust steward. And he talks about a man that was a steward in charge of a rich man's household. And he was wasting that man's goods. He was being dishonest in his dealings. And so the master of the house called him up and said, look, you need to give an account because you're going to lose your job. And so the man sat back and he said, I'm about to be out of a job. And he says, how am I going to take care of myself? He says, I'm too proud to beg. And evidently he wasn't physically fit enough to dig or to be a farmer. So he sat back and he said, how am I going to support myself? So then he came up with an idea. And he went to one of his master's debtors and he said, how much do you owe my master? And he said, 100 bushels of wheat. And he says, okay, sit down and write 80 and we'll call it even. And then he called another one and he says, how much do you owe my master? Well, 100 vats of oil. Sit down and write 50 and we'll call it even. And what he was doing was he was ingratiating himself to these people because he said, when I'm thrown out of my job, they will receive me into their houses because I did them a favor, then they'll take care of me. Now here's the point. Jesus in the story says the master looked at him and commended him for being wise. He found something to admire, but he fired him. And Jesus wasn't trying to say, hey, go out and be a cheat to get ahead. But what he was saying was, the master found something he could admire, and Jesus turns around and says, you know what, we need to be as wise as the children of God. We need to be wise in our dealings with the world, not cheats, not dishonest, but wise. And the end result of all of that was Jesus was saying, look, the physical things that God has blessed you with, use them to the glory of God so that God will be pleased with you. That was the moral of that story. But we can find those things to admire when they are deserving of admiration. All right. He also goes on and says, those things that are excellent. What's the difference between something that's admirable, something that's noble, and something that's excellent? That's right. That's what this particular word means, is something that is morally excellent, outstanding, goodness. It's the highest of virtue. This is somebody who is, Jesus, when, was it Nathan that he said he saw, and he says, here is an Israelite in whom is no guile. Or was that Nathaniel? Nathaniel, yes. He says, here is an Israelite in whom is no guile. That would be somebody that he was saying, your character is excellent. And so that's the type of thing that we need to be thinking about. And then finally he comes up and says, whatsoever is praiseworthy. Well, what are things that are praiseworthy? They're worthy of our praise. They're things that, that word pretty much defines itself. The things that are deserving of praise are worthy of praise. And so in all of this, I went through and defined all of those for you because I want you to see that there's a lot of overlap in them, seems like, but there were particular differences in everything that Paul was mentioning here. But to sum it all up, what he's simply saying is those things that are good and noble and of high morality and character, and the things in the world that are the exact opposite of the vulgar, cheap, bad things in the world. The Christian is to focus their mind upon the things that are higher. And you might think, okay, well, that's easy. Yeah, I see that. But how often is it that we find ourselves focusing and rolling around in our mind on something that's not good? Think about this. Yes, Karen?
For one thing, you can not focus on other things. Don't take those images into account. And then you have room for the good and healthy, positive things.
Right. Right. She said, don't focus on the things that are ugly and wrong. Then you have room for focusing on that which is good. What I want us to see is, how do we do that? How do we not focus on the things that are ugly and bad and focus on the things that are good? As I've been saying all through this, we live in an information age. And if we're always focused on all that availability of information, we're going to be finding ourselves focusing on things that are bad, because that's how, have you ever heard the term clickbait? That's how they get you, is they present something that's supposed to stir you up emotionally or whatever, and you, yeah. Tigger, as I look over this audience, there's probably a mixture. Some of you are probably very familiar with TikTok or Facebook or Instagram or whatever. And all of that is designed to get you hooked and to draw you in. Those people have spent untold numbers of dollars on algorithms that are designed to get you drawn in and to bring your attention to things. And the majority of it is not good. And it's not just that, though. Like I've said, the news programs are built around the same. It used to be news was just reporting the facts about whatever happened. Nowadays, it's all about spinning it to get you hooked in and to draw you into a particular frame of a mindset. And that's the exact opposite of what the Apostle Paul is talking about here. The Apostle Paul is saying we need to be focusing our mind on the things that are good, noble, true, right, pure, lovely, admirable, excellent, and praiseworthy. And the things you find on social media are oftentimes not that. And the things that you find on the news are often not that. And so the Christian needs to be very careful about this. Now, let me ask you this. Why is it so important for us to think on the right things? That may seem like a simple question, but I want to hear your answer. Why is it so important for the Christian to focus his mind on the right things? Okay, you're right about the distraction. What'd you say, Melissa? Bernita? Yeah. Okay, explain that, because you're right, Bernita, you're right, so that you won't go astray. But why? Why would focusing your mind on the wrong things make you go astray?
Because you wouldn't have the right things in your mind, and where your thoughts go sometimes is where your actions.
There's the point I was trying to get you to say, and you're exactly right. Bernita says, where your mind goes, so does your actions. You think about that. You are not going to do something that you hadn't thought. Look with me to Proverbs, the 4th chapter. In Proverbs, the 4th chapter, and in verse 23, turn to the right place here. It says, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Everything you do flows from your heart. So keep your heart. In the New Testament, there's lots of instances where Jesus talked about this, and in one particular instance that's recorded in Matthew, Mark, Luke, but I'm going to turn you to Mark's rendition of it, because it's, I believe, is the fullest of what Jesus was saying here. But in Mark, the 7th chapter, and down in verse 20, Mark 7 and verse 20, Jesus said, what comes out of a person is what defiles them. What comes out of a person. For from within, out of a person's heart, that evil thoughts come. Sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside and defile a person. Now, I want to ask you, if you're there, if you turned over to Mark 7, he says, from within, out of a person's heart, evil thoughts come. Then he said evil thoughts come, but then he turns right around and starts naming all these things. Sexual immorality, theft, murder. Are any of those thoughts? All right, there's the point. Jason said they start out as thoughts. All these things that he's talking about here, sexual immorality, theft, murder, those are actions. But they started out as thoughts. You're not going to murder somebody without there first being, murder is different from accidentally taking someone's life. Murder, John says, begins with hate. Whoever hates his brother is a murderer, John says. So murder, sexual immorality, theft, those things aren't going to happen unless we first think about them. Then he talks about adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, folly. All of those things begin as thoughts first that come from the heart. And that's why Paul's trying to tell them, look, you focus upon the good things of God in this world. Think about them, because as you think, so it is that your actions are going to be. And then he goes on and sums it up in Philippians, the 4th chapter, after saying all of that we should think on these things. In verse 9 he says, whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put into practice, and the God of peace will be with you. What they've learned and received, heard or seen. That's focusing on people that are good examples, focusing on teaching that is right and proper. You put that into practice, and he says the God of peace will be with us. Up before in verse 6, he says we'll get the peace of God. Here he says the God of peace will be with you. All right. We've got one left, and everything is right on schedule. 1 week left. Next week, we're going to easily be able to finish up Paul's instruction concerning contentment. Hey, if you know what's in those 13 verses, then you can clearly understand how we're going to be able to finish up. All right, appreciate your attention this morning.